Okay, so what I wanted to do today is there's a part of like this whole conflict that adds complications to it that no one really ever talks about, and it's about the geography of the conflict, right? It's about topography, it's about hills and coastal plains and the desert and all that. And I think it helps add a little bit of considerations for like actual policymakers who have to deal with this conflict. Where are you going to draw the lines, things like that. What kind of arrangements are you going to have in some kind of future Palestinian state? Something like that. So, what up, man? So this is basically the geography part of geopolitics, and you'll see pretty easily how it connects. So basically, I'll show you graphics once they're important, okay? Because I thought I'd have a projector, but it's Shabbat, so no projector. Basically, you just talk about Israel at all. Israel if you think about it, right? If you look at Israel, right, and you know who the traditional powers of the Middle East throughout history are, it's Egypt, Iran / Persia, and Turkey, right? And you see Israel right there, right? If any of these countries want to protect their, want to be able to expand north, Egypt in case north, and Turkey and Iran be able to expand south into Africa, you have to go through Israel throughout all of history, right? So that's like one of the more important things, right? Go to the next one. So we're going to talk about 4 actual geographical regions of Israel. The first one's the Negev. There isn't too much to say about it. It's really hilly. If anyone's ever Beersheba over here, anyone who's driven up from Eilat, which I know that we just did, it's really hilly. It's really big. It's not hard to figure out why it would be defensive, right? It's very sparsely populated. You could basically give ground there for a while, Then we're also going to talk about the coastal plain, right? And you can see, based on this graphic, all the green, right? Going from the south all the way up through Haifa, right? Basically from Gaza to Haifa, right? Is the Israeli coastal plain, okay? It's flat. It's easily, you can traverse it very easily, right? It's not very easy to defend. Even if you were to dig into it, you're going to hit water eventually because it's low, right?
It's also a beautiful place.
It is indeed, for those of you who haven't been to Tel Aviv. All right. We're talking about a little bit about the Jordan Valley, which is, created where the Jordan River is, and it separates, Beit Sean knows about it. It's a nice little flat area between Jordan and Israel, right? It goes down, right? And finally, we're going to talk about the Big Kahuna. We're going to talk about the Judean Hill Country, okay? Which, basically, if you're coming from the south, right? If you're coming from the coastal plain, it's flat, flat, flat. Anyone who's driven from like Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, you see the sudden difference in topography, right? It's flat, 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 and then you can see in the distance giant hills. And once you get there, you're basically, you're headed towards Jerusalem, right? And if you look at the map, like this is actually showing you basically the borders of today's West Bank, right? It covers these hill ranges right here. And then right there in the middle, it says it in Hebrew, Yerushalayim. That's Jerusalem, right in the center of it, right? So basically, this is mostly about Jerusalem, the geopolitical importance of Jerusalem. Despite all the holiness, despite all the historical significance of Jerusalem, Jerusalem is traditionally the administrative center of whatever way you want to organize this region, because it's easily defensible in the Judean hills, right? And it's right in the center. It connects all 4 of these geographic regions I just talked about, right in the center. So it's a natural capital. It's a natural, when the Ottomans controlled it, it was like an administrative center from the south, basically here to the south. Anyone who's ever, Crusaders, Kingdom of Jerusalem, capital is obviously Jerusalem, So I think one could almost argue that, if you're not super religious, that maybe even religious significance comes out of its strategic position. I just said that. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to show, right, is Israeli population dispersion, right? You can see next to no one lives here in the south, right? Sorry, Beersheba. Um, and then everyone lives along the coastal plain into Jerusalem, and a decent population in the north, but still mostly around the coastal plain. Okay, if you look at a map, right? So here, it's only 15 kilometers from the sea to these Judean hills, right? So basically, what I'm saying. So how does this affect like politics, right? When Israel looks at ceding land or ending the occupation, things like that, things that they will have to consider is that to release the West Bank means that at their thinnest point, they're only 15 kilometers wide, and and that's about 9 miles, right? So you can easily cut the country in half, right? The second thing you have to think about, right, is right now Israel is set up in a very, very good defensive position, right? Like say any invasion were to come from the east, right? It has to go through Jordan, down into the Jordan Valley, and then fight up the Judean hills. Really easy defensible. Anyone who like drives through this area can see that it's hard to walk, let alone fight up. You know. So, and then the last thing that I think is definitely worth considering, right, is I have a little graphic here that shows the ranges of, for instance, Qassam rockets in Gaza, right? And you can see the green is where the vast majority of their rockets can reach, right? You can see Sderot in there, which most people who went on Birthright went to Sderot and saw some 17,000 rockets have hit Sderot in the last 10, 15 years, right? So, but if you look at the dispersion of the Israeli population, you can see that actually affects a minority of the Israeli population. Like in Beersheba, I know you had to go into bomb shelters, but how many actual rockets came your way?
Like a couple, like 3 maybe?
Exactly.
I wasn't even there.
These border communities are under much more constant barrage,
Yeah.
right? So, knowing that, if, God forbid, in some kind of future Palestinian state, some kind of organization like Hamas were to be able to take over an area like the West Bank, suddenly 80 to 90% of Israel's population is under potential barrage. So these are considerations, especially from the Israeli side of things, when you're trying to think about a peace deal that you're going to consider, and that for some reason no one ever talks about. And I just kind of wanted to bring that up and connect the geography to the politics, and then discuss. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sorry.
She's my roommate.
Most of these people
Just
either
these
live
two.
with us or. Okay.
Yeah.
So you said that Jerusalem is easily defensible because of it being in the hills,
Yes.
the Judean hills. Hasn't Jerusalem been sacked and destroyed like a whole bunch of times?
It's 100% because of its strategic position, right? So it's great cost to get it right. If you look at the Third Crusade, basically the Saracen army was completely decimated over by Jaffa, right? And the Crusaders, all they had to do was just get to Jerusalem, but they lost so much attrition just trying to get up the hills and constant harassment by the Saracen cavalry that they weren't able to take the city despite extreme superior numbers.
Okay. And my follow-up to that is, do you think that's relevant in terms of like how, I mean, I definitely agree with you in saying like it is majorly a consideration that Israel would be 15 kilometers across if the entire line of the West, if we went back to 1948, the Green Line, and also that like with rocket fire coming from the West Bank, it would be, if you put the entire population center of the country within range, that's a big deal. But I have a question about like you saying that one of the reasons that Jerusalem has to be the administrative center is because it's easily defensible because of the hills. I feel like as warfare has changed now, that's like high ground seems to me to be less relevant. Like we have planes, we have technology that it just straight up doesn't matter what the topography is a lot of the time because we have heat seeking stuff, we have radar like scanning, we have drones, we have like unmanned type stuff, and it's just you're not fighting up a hill. You're not like it's not a ground war
Mhm.
that you're losing men because they're being shot at downward.
I feel you. In fact, during 1967, Jerusalem was actually taken by Israeli paratroopers, not by a ground invasion up the hills, right? Because that's, as I just explained, that's really hard to do. That being said, with Israel's own military might, you can't. None of its enemies have like the transport planes to be able to just drop thousands of paratroopers, right? Like there would be some kind of ground invasion. It's the only way to take the country.
I figure it would be
Bolton?
like unmanned kind of just rockets.
How do
and
you
drones
occupy?
and-
How do you?
Oh,
yeah.
Israeli military superiority in the region is not in question.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's important to say, like, also in the 6-Day War, we conquered Jerusalem, and it caught also us by surprise. Like, it was only 6 days to capture Jerusalem. It was really surprised. And the mountain over Jerusalem really not hurt,
Helped.
disturbed the radar. So it's not easy for the radar to see if there is a mountain that's just over there.
Right, so it can provide cover for the invading army as well.
Exactly,
Mhm.
and the parachutes in the 6-Day War, actually they caught Jerusalem by foot.
Oh, didn't know that, Sin.
Yeah,
Okay, I just knew they were paratroopers, so I figured they parachuted in.
yeah,
Yeah.
actually, just they go by foot, and this is what's amazing, this war.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Also, if you think about, like, I think some 800 Israelis died in the 6-Day War, right? And not a lot of that came on the Sinai front because the Egyptian army was basically running away the entire time because they were caught off guard by the Israeli surprise air attack, right? A lot of the deaths came in the Golan and to take the West Bank. And I don't think there's any coincidence there that has to do with the hilly country you have to take. It's harder to fight uphill. This is a discussion, so you guys can ask each other questions and whatnot. Like, so when I show you guys this, has anyone ever really like thought about that before, about the geographical part of the conflict? Yeah,
No,
yeah, a little bit.
I thought you were gonna talk about like what is Israel today, or like what
I think we're covered. that.
was
Mhm.
it in the past, or like what's considered like Palestine today. Like that was like my interpretation of like what it was gonna be. I didn't.
So I have a question. What do you think it's why we have a fight with the Palestinians?
Why do I think?
Yeah, why do you think the Israeli and the Palestine have all
I'm
this?
under the impression they both want this land. They both think it's theirs because of historical significance.
That's true. It's
At
all,
a very basic level.
that's true. It's all about the land. A lot of people think it's a religious fight, but it's not. It's all about the land. And I think this is what Aaron tried to make us understand, that this is a war on land, and he tried to show us exactly the land that we have in Israel and the difference between each area. And I think it's really interesting for us to discuss about what we think about the land, what we think the Israeli country should be, what we think the Palestine should be and look like, if it should be, and of course. And I think this is the discussion that has to be. Like there is two arguments about the Palestinian land, if we want to come back to the 48 lines or 67 line. It's really different.
Mhm.
And we need to see what each line give us, what each line give them, and to understand what we think it's the better for everyone who thinks.
So you mentioned that Israel will eventually have to consider that divide and how to make that happen. So what? There's no wrong answer to this, but tell me as you prepare for this, what you really think will be that push to make them decide how do we split up the land.
So I think we can all like sort of think about that and talk about that. Like my personal opinion, I am sympathetic to the security aspirations, considerations, excuse me, like of perhaps like Israeli, what some might consider like hardliners, right? I think it's a tough thing to ask modern day Israelis to abandon the West Bank in the same way, say, Gaza, was abandoned, right? And I think Israelis see a lot of times in black and white and see what Gaza turned into. And then all they can see is these giant hills up there. If that is the future Palestinian state, even under the Palestinian Authority, which is unarmed, when Gaza was abandoned, it was given to the Palestinian Authority, and then they lost in an election where Hamas won, and then there was a huge fight between Hamas and Fatah. Fatah is the Palestinian Authority that kicked Palestinian Authority completely, almost completely. They're still there, but barely, out of Gaza. And since then, thousands of rockets have been fired. And I think it's a tough thing to ask Israelis to do the same thing. So, how do we get there? I don't think it can be a simple give it to them tomorrow. It's got to be trust building. It's got to be things that we talked about with Yasmina, the British Muslim woman in the village. The people have to trust each other first. Israelis have to trust that rockets won't be fired on them from a future Palestinian state in the West Bank. And Palestinians have to trust Israelis to treat them fairly and understand these borders will be set.
But what do you think is going to be the pushing point that, as you were researching?
What would
yeah,
convince Israel to go in?
any of them, yeah.
I don't think any outside force is going to do it. I think it's going to come from inside, and I think it's going to have everything to do with what I just talked about: is time and eventual trust building between the two sides.
So you don't think violence would precipitate that kind of a conversation?
No. In fact, there's a historical precedence to say that it won't. Israel offered Yasser Arafat about 97% of the West Bank, 100% of Gaza, and a capital in East Jerusalem, right? Yasser Arafat felt, for whatever reason, that wasn't enough and decided to say no to that peace plan, right? And what immediately followed that was mad Palestinian frustration that ended up in the Second Intifada, right? Which this now starts to get into opinion, but thousands of Israelis died and even more Palestinians died, and all that did was any peace camp that existed in Israel basically, for the most part, disappeared. Any peace camp that had political weight disappeared, because we have Israelis in here, but I think if I were an Israeli, I'd be like, we gave them what they wanted, and they still reacted with violence. So now I feel that Israelis feel, Israel's a safe place. They've found a way to manage this conflict. I don't think it's sustainable, but they have found a way to manage conflict. Israelis feel safe. I think most Israelis you would probably talk to would say something along the lines of, we've tried this before and it didn't work. So it's kind of like you got to start all over.
Do you think that Palestinians feel, some, not all obviously, but some Palestinians feel that there's no other way to try to get their land back besides with violence because of how strong the Israeli army is and how strong of a presence that Israel has now? Like, they kind of probably feel that there's no other way to even go about trying to get the land back because nothing has worked in the past.